It was really hard to pick favorites. I've had such a love affair with this deck for the last 3 months. It has a glitter keyword card. How could I resist? Hello everybody, it's Sylvie. Welcome back to Tarot Magpie. I hope you're doing all kinds of good today. I'm talking best decks of 2024. More specifically, these are the decks that I felt were most impactful on my practice in 2024, and I've actually been really restrained. I have 6 decks for you because it was either going to be 6 or 60. I really struggled to narrow this down, and I'm going to film a bonus video of the sort of runners up, which I will pop over on Patreon. Before I get into it, I would love to hear what your favorite decks were this last year. What were the most standout decks in your own practice? Drop me a comment below. I would love to hear and also get some recommendations. Interestingly, none of these decks were published last year. I acquired 3 of them last year. 3 of them I already had, but none of these were 2024 publications. And actually, I don't think I acquired a lot of 2024 publications anyway. So I'm gonna get into it. Starting with the decks that I already had as we entered 2024 is the Ritual Tarot. Is anybody surprised to see this on this list? Probably not. This is the marked edition with the very sort of subtle titles on the back of the deck. This came into my collection in December of 2023, so I did have it before 2024 started, but just barely. You know what this looks like. If you've been on my channel before, if you've been around these parts on TarotTube, I'm sure that you recognize this artwork. It is collage. I love a collage deck. There is at least one more in this little shortlist. It's just incredible, and I have used this throughout the year. I have picked this up, I think, the most frequently. I recently did Chanel's end of the year tarot tag, and I think this was the deck that I pulled out as my most used deck of 2024 because I pulled this out consistently throughout the year. I had a lot of love affairs with a lot of decks, some of which you will see in this video, but this is a deck that I reached for sort of throughout the year, no matter the season. I use this for actually a lot of different kinds of readings. I know that this has a bit of a reputation as quite like an intense deck, and it definitely is that, don't get me wrong, but I also have used it for pretty much anything. I love a collage deck. I'm repeating myself. So these, I will say though, these majors are just incredible pieces of artwork. So that is the Ritual Tarot. Absolutely no surprises that this made it on my best decks of 2024. Another deck that I already had that predated 2025 is this, which is the Goddess of Love Tarot. I liked this deck entering 2024. It was already in my good books, but I just had such a love affair with it. I pulled it out for Taurus season as my daily draw deck. Really got to know the guidebook, which I've also grabbed. I've highlighted and underlined bits, and in the beginning as well, like the front matter in this is really cool. There's spreads, there's rituals. The major arcana each have an affirmation, a journal question, and a ritual attached. This deck has such a strong and consistent theming to it. It's a book and deck for embodying the erotic, divine, feminine. So if that's your bag, I'd recommend this deck. The author, Gabriella Herstick, has a book about sex magic, which I finally finished reading, by the way. It was really good. A lot of tarot stuff in there too. So love and sex magic is her thing. It's something she obviously cares very deeply about, and it's something that is throughout the guidebook. It is still a tarot deck, you know, it's not taken huge leaps and bounds with the interpretations. Each of the major arcana is associated with a love or sex goddess from different pantheons, different traditions. Like I say, there are those affirmations, there are those rituals, there are those journal prompts. I think the minor arcana, the minor arcana, I think, also have an affirmation and a journal question. So you can totally use this deck as part of a personal practice to connect with the divine feminine, to to connect with the divine erotic for sex magic. If that's something that you want to incorporate tarot with, the book is set up for you to do that. I just love this deck. I just love this deck, mainly because it's gorgeous. I told you I like collage decks, I didn't mean to show collage decks back to back, but here we are. I do love these backs. I love pink. Like the aesthetic is so perfect. I just think it's so beautiful. This badass, I think, are we the crone? Is that the king? I think the crone is the king, but the guidebook does say like the traditional association where things have been renamed. The guidebook does have the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith card name in it. So it's just so good. This was just such a standout deck. I feel like I've not really reached for this much in the past like 6 months or so. I already liked it, and then in 2024 I fell in love with it. And then the third deck that I had prior to 2024 is the Tarot of Aphrodite by Natasha Fromm. This is the first edition. Again, I didn't intend to put this back to back with the Goddess of Love, but obviously they share some theming. And the reason this is in my top decks of 2024 is because I really developed a particular practice with this deck last year. I started using this pretty much exclusively to chat to Aphrodite. It sits on the altar space that I have for her, and this is the only deck in my collection that I have dedicated to a specific type of practice, and I've really enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed having this deck kind of have its own job and have its own space and using it for its own purpose. There's not a whole ton of things that I think I would want to do that for, but I've really enjoyed it and it's really added to my practice. I don't actually do a lot of spreads with this, and I think that's something I want to start exploring in 2025. I just kind of pull cards to see what she has to say, and it was actually extremely kind of spooky magical, because when I first started doing this, I think for the first 2 or 3 readings I pulled the Empress, the Aphrodite Venus card. So I was like, okay, she's this is correct. This is what she wants. I also just love this deck. It's one of my favorite fine art decks that I've seen. I think the images that have been chosen are really, really good, and I adore having it in my collection. I know that some of the images have been changed for subsequent versions, but this is the one I have. I absolutely love it. The Tarot of Aphrodite. Moving on to the decks that I acquired actually in 2024. First up is the Tarot of a Moon Garden. This is the borderless edition that was published, I think this was published at the end of 2023. Maybe it was published in 2024. I bought this in 2024. I bought this in May, right before I moved. I actually bought this the day before I moved up because I was at a market and they had it, and look at these delicious Cadbury purple edges. How could I resist? And this was not exactly an impulse buy because I had been interested in it, but the day that I bought it was an impulse purchase. And at first I was like, oh, it's pretty, but I don't know if I need it. I don't know if I could have survived without it, etc. But this is one of those decks that just I ended up reaching for frequently and have just grown to really love. I sound like that's a big surprise. Obviously, I hope that happens with all of the decks that I use. My first impression of this deck was not negative. It was just kind of neutral. I was like, oh, it's nice. I don't think it's invaluable in my practice, but it's one of those decks that just really surprised me with how much I reach for it. And what's really interesting too is that I don't reach for the guidebook with this. I just reach for the cards. And the guidebook is actually really cool. It's chunky, and each card, majors and minors included, has the rendering, which talks about the specific artwork in the deck, the reading, which is how to interpret it in a reading, and then the ritual. And there is a ritual for every single card in this deck. There's runes, there's recipes, for goodness sake. Like, it's really, really cool. I think it's quite Wicca-y. I am not Wiccan, but like there's the Reel of the Year, and the way that you kind of consecrate it feels quite adjacent to that. And I think the guidebook's really cool, don't get me wrong, but I haven't really reached for it. I've mainly just used the deck, and it's become one that I really love reaching for, and often when I don't know what to reach for, I will reach for this, which I just didn't really expect. I think it's gorgeous. One of the reasons I've always wanted it is because I love the art style, and I actually really like, I can't get enough of these edges. I really like this like long skinny shape. I think it's really fun. But I ended up using this in the year ahead readings I did for this year, for 2025, which was totally spur of the moment. I didn't intend to do that, and then we were kind of going to bed just after midnight. I was like, you know what, I'm going to pull some cards. And this was one of the decks that I reached for. I just really love using it. I adore this death card. Yeah, it just really took me by surprise. with how seamlessly it kind of fell into my practice, because like I say, I've not really read the guidebook. I didn't have to try very hard to get to know this. It just one day I was like, oh, I'm loving this. I'm reaching for this all the time, and I thoroughly enjoy using it. So that is the Tarot of a Moon Garden. This is the Prairie Majesty Oracle, which I feel like I've talked about ad nauseum on this channel. I've pulled this out for so many different kinds of reading, for so many different kinds of practice. I've pulled this out for some mind mapping practice. I've paired this with pretty much everything in my collection. I just absolutely adore this deck. So this is an oracle. It is the only oracle in this list, and this is by Cara Simons and Amy Putney Koenig for the artwork, and this was indie, but this is the Hay House mass market publication that I have. I've got to do something about these edges, and I don't know whether I want to just color them black or whether I want to color code according to like the suits. But like, it's got a glitter card. I've wanted this for a good long while, actually. I think I've wanted it pretty much since it went mass market with Hay House, because I like the questions. I just love how versatile this deck is. You can use it to create spreads because you can just pull cards and be like, okay, where am I ready to leap forward? Is my pursuit both honorable and focused? How can I be of service? Pull a tarot card for each of those. You've got a reading. You could pick them intentionally. You could pick them at random, you know, shuffle and pull cards blindly. I really enjoy the keywords. These are some celestial cards, which are kind of a little bit different. They're not in the suits. The keywords for this are also really cool. Like, there was a glitter keyword, which you know I'm gonna love. There's a metamorphosis in here somewhere. I think metamorphosis is one of my favorite words. So I really like the keywords. I really like the guidebook. And also the kind of point of this is the Prairie Majesty Oracle. We have these prairie animals and plants and like elements, I think. Originally, I think one of the reasons I wasn't immediately purchasing this deck was because it's the Prairie Majesty Oracle. I am from the UK. I live in Scotland. This is not my typical environment, so I don't have that kind of connection with it because it's not a landscape I am from or familiar with. And maybe as a result, I don't look to the animal first and foremost, the animal or the plant or whatever is in the deck. Oh, I adore this. But the guidebook is so good at diving into the card, the associations with each animal. I really love that the keywords aren't necessarily super obvious for the animal. So like here we have the earthworm with breathe, and like they're underground. You would think maybe like there's a dig in here somewhere. That would maybe be the most obvious choice, but I really like the slightly unexpected pairings of the animal and the keyword. I just adore this. It pairs with so many decks in my collection so well, and I do love to pair decks. That should be no surprise. Here we go, we've got wildfire and wind, so there are some elements in here as well. I love the kind of ecological theming, the focus, the inspiration. Here we go, that's the whole deck for you. It's so good. I have raved about this so much. It is definitely one of my favorite oracle decks in my whole collection. I have really developed a love for oracle decks in the past 2 years. Like 2 years ago, I was like, oh, there's one or two, but I'm not an oracle deck person. And now I absolutely love an oracle deck, and I really love finding good oracle decks that excite me and that I can work with in really cool ways, and this is definitely one of them. All right, finally, this deck is probably no surprise. It's the Circle of Doors Tarot. I have raved about this ever since I got it. Literally the first guidebook entry I looked at, it was the Seven of Wands. Here it is, which is keys in this deck. This little verse, why is getting what I asked for so irritating? I was immediately like, oh, I'm gonna love this deck. I'm gonna love this deck. And I do. I will start with the guidebook since I've already opened her up. Every single card in this deck, the majors and the minors, get the same treatment, which I really love when decks do that. Like I said, the Moon Garden did that as well. So every deck we've got the title, we've got a keyword, which in the minor arcana are printed on the cards. There is a interpretation of what the card means, affirmations, and then this verse here, which I feel like these are usually from the perspective of the card, but that might not always be the case. Four of Cups is one of my January cards for this year. This is also a deck that I pulled out for my year ahead reading spur of the moment. So Four of Cups, benevolence, And the description isn't about the specific artwork, which in this deck I don't mind. Usually that's it's not a deal breaker by any stretch, but it is something that I like to see, is a specific reference to the elements in the card. I think maybe because this is photographic, that's a little bit more obvious, or just the way that the description flows, it makes sense. I really love the writing in this. I think it's beautiful. These affirmations are really interesting as well. I don't ever read affirmations as affirmations, but I do find them just a really interesting extra perspective on the card. Because obviously, even if a card is really negative, say like the Tower or the Three of Swords or something that's typically quite like an ouchy kind of card, the affirmations are going to be the positive spin on it. So it's just interesting to get that perspective. And then, like I say, these verses are very emotive, and the description is not necessarily, it's a little bit more like the facts of the matter of the card, if that makes sense. And then this is like coming from the card. I love the guidebook. I adore the guidebook. These backs are stunning. Also, like, this is just such a luxe deck. The box is beautiful. This gilding is beautiful. They're huge, but the cardstock is delicious. And even though they're massive, they do a side riffle really well. Oh, here we go. This is the card that is on the front of the box, the Maiden of Keys. And I will say my only, not really issue with this deck, but just the only thing that maybe is a little bit frustrating is the fact that the court cards are renamed, which is fine, but the way the guidebook discusses them, it is not obvious, like what the page has been renamed to, what the knight has been renamed to, etc. And like, I don't really mind that. I think it's just cool to take them on their own merit, and I don't think there's anything wrong with restructuring the courts. I think that's really cool, but that is the only thing I can think of that like might be a frustration. Obviously, if you don't like the art style, you don't like the art style, etc. But in terms of the sort of technical specifications of the deck, that's the only thing that like potentially bothers me. And mainly it's from the perspective of when I am maybe recording and I'm pulling cards and I want to be like, oh, we've got the Six of Cups and the Page of Wands. Let's look at some cards, shall we? I've definitely shown this off a lot recently. When did I get this? This was sent to me, full disclosure, this was sent to me by the creators in, I think, September. And like I say, I immediately fell in love with it. I've been using it consistently ever since. It can be brutal, don't get me wrong, but it's good. It's kind of, it's always spot on. It's just not the kindest deck. It's not the gentlest deck. Whereas something like the Tower of the Moon Garden, especially reading the guidebook entries, there is a kind of gentleness and like a whimsy and like a magical softness to this deck. This deck is just gonna tell you the truth and the whole truth. I don't feel like its priority is being nice. If you want nice, you go to a different deck. If you want insight, this is the deck for you. So, oh, I love it. This is just, like I say, such a standout favorite. I only got it in September, so I've been using it for 3 and a bit months, but I just completely fell in love with it. And every time I have pulled this deck out, that has been affirmed. So total love affair with this deck for the last 3 months. When I was talking about the Ritual Tarot being a little bit kind of intense, it's a similar kind of energy between these two. And they've both got a level of abstraction, and that is something that I like in a deck, is a level of abstraction. So even though this is a real people deck, which I've said time and again is not my favorite, because of this multiple exposure, it looks kind of dreamlike, it looks kind of unreal. It's not a scene, you know, I'm not going to step outside and see this because it's like 3 photos layered on top of each other. There is some kind of weirdness going on with the imagery, and I appreciate that. That makes it readable for me personally. I can't do portrait decks, I can't do people looking at me, I can't do really realistic modern scenes. And then obviously the Ritual Tarot, being a collage deck, also has that sense of surrealism, and every deck that I've shown you has a sense of surrealism. They're either collage or they're kind of in a art style that is not a realistic art style. So that is everything. Those are my top 6 decks of 2024. Were any of these a surprise? I really did struggle to narrow it down, and like I say, I'm going to do a runners up didn't quite make the list. Probably significantly more decks video. I'll put that over on Patreon for my Magpie members. So go check that out if you're interested. That will be up in a couple days probably. And that will just be everything that I loved, but it didn't quite have the weight behind it to make it into like a standout decks of 2024 video. I'm curious, did any of these decks make your personal favorites? Is there a deck that you think I really need to try out that you think I would love? Let me know in the comments. And that is everything from me. Thank you so much for joining, for spending some time with me. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more from me, please do consider joining us over on Patreon. The link will be in the description down below, along with a link to my Etsy store for my readings and tarot spread zines. Give me a like if you liked this, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.